Welcome to Culture Lab June. Can you believe it? June is here already, like halfway through the year. The year's gone so fast. Welcome to Culture Lab. If you're listening to this, watching this for the first time, or you've just happened to come across this, welcome. This is our monthly discipleship leadership training. We put out videos once a month on our YouTube channel. You can also pick up these videos in the archive if you go to our website, /culture, and you can pick up all the previous episodes. What we're doing is, in Culture Lab, we are unpacking our values as a church. We have values that you can find on our website, and just over the last few months, including this month, we are just running through one by one our values. Why are we doing this? Because we want to be intentional about the culture that we're building here at CityLife Church. We want a culture is either built by design or by default. And so many times culture can be something which we don't think intentionally about. But we want to be a healthy church. We want to be a thriving church, a grown church, a church of disciples. And so we want to do that. And so we need to be intentional, which is why we are running this series of Culture Lab. And we also run, alongside these videos, we also run leadership coaching groups. And it's a new model that we're trying out, and it's been run really effectively. And so if you want to dive deeper in discipleship and leadership training, and you're watching this video right now, my encouragement would be for you to sign up to a leadership group, coaching group. You can go to our website, /culture, to learn more about that and details on how to register. And for the majority of people watching right now, you might already be in a leadership coaching group, which is fantastic, which really makes sure that we're not just listening and digesting the content every month, a part of Culture Lab, but we are really processing this through in terms of application and personal growth. And so let's dive into this month's content for Culture Lab June. All right, so I'm going to start off with the scripture, and then I'm going to talk about a value. Proverbs 11 verse 24, in the Message translation, it says, "The world of the generous gets larger and larger." Guess what we're going to talk about today? We're going to talk about generosity. One of our values is that we are generous. The verse again says, "The world of the generous gets larger and larger." But listen to the opposite impact. The world of the stingy, it says, gets smaller and smaller. Verse 25, "The one who blesses others is abundantly blessed. Those who help others are helped." I would like to talk for a few moments on the atomy of generosity, the atomy of the generous. Using the body as a metaphor, there are various parts of the body, and I'm going to break down just 4 parts of generosity that I'm calling the atomy of generosity. Have you ever been somewhere or met someone that was so, so contagious in their attitude, in a good way, in a positive way, that you wanted to bottle that attitude up and sprinkle it on other people? When I think about generosity, I would love to bottle up the generosity of my grandparents. You might know them if you know our story and know the background of church, but my grandparents, who pioneered our church many years ago, they were the most generous people. When I think of the word generosity, when I think of a generous person or a generous couple, I think of my grandparents. They were the most generous people that I know. In fact, they used to have people all over the world stay with them. They used to host missionaries from all over the world and different people who they would have connections with, and they used to call themselves the Hilton Hotel. They used to call their own house the Hilton Hotel, and it was probably better hospitality even than the Hilton Hotel, the official Hilton Hotel. And I remember growing up, I used to look at the guest book. They used to have in their guest room a guest book of hundreds and hundreds of people who stayed in the Hilton, the unofficial Hilton Hotel. And I remember reading the messages of just how many people are so grateful and thank you so much for being so hospitable and for being so generous. And I just noticed just how many connections and friends and acquaintances they had all over the world because they practiced generous hospitality. And because of their generosity, they lived a big life. They lived a generous life. And they had lots of friends, and they were highly respected because they were generous people. It wasn't something they did occasionally. It was just part of who they were. And as a church, we want to build a healthy culture. And part of a healthy culture, a healthy church, is a generous culture, which is why one of our values is generosity. We are generous. We want the disciples that we develop in our church. We want the leaders that come through the life of our church. We want them to have a mark of generosity, a stamp of generosity, a culture, a spirit of generosity. Why? Because it's kingdom culture. Winston Churchill, the wartime Prime Minister of Great Britain, once said, "We make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we give." What a great quote. We can limit generosity in terms of our understanding of the word. We can limit it to the area of finances. But we know that sometimes the most generous people didn't have a lot of finance to give, but they were generous in spirit. And that's the kind of generosity that I'm talking about. Generosity does certainly include finance and trusting God in our finances. But generosity is much more than that. It's much more than our bank account. It's about our heart. And so the Christian vision is the transformation of a person's heart. That's the gospel vision. That's the Christian vision, is the total transformation or reorientation of a person's heart. The gospel of Jesus is a message of God's generous love, kindness, mercy, and goodness towards us. And when we, as Christians, hear, or maybe when you became a Christian for the first time, you can remember hearing this generous gospel, the message of God's generous love and kindness towards us. And what happened the moment we received Jesus through hearing the gospel? What happened was God's generosity won the allegiance of our heart. God's generosity through what He did on the cross through Jesus won our hearts over to Him. And that's what it means to be a Christian, is to have the allegiance of our heart towards Jesus. And so it's from the heart. It's not an obligation. It's not a law. It's not even just a principle. It's something which is internal within the life of a Christian. That's what it ought to be. And so the gospel transforms our heart into somebody that wants to give and not just get. Why is generosity one of our values? Well, I think Jesus gives a good answer to that question. In Matthew 5, verse 16, it says this. These are Jesus' words. "In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may notice and see your good deeds," or you could say generous deeds, "and glorify your Father in heaven." Jesus is saying, let your light shine before others. What does letting your light shine before others mean? It means to allow your good deeds, generous deeds, to be seen, to have good deeds, to have generous deeds towards others. And that generosity, those good deeds, will glorify our Father in heaven. People will notice that we're a Christian through the mark of generosity. And so I want to unpack the atomy of the generous, the atomy of generosity. And I've got 4 things here, all linked to body parts. You ready? Number 1, a way of thinking. Generosity is, number 1, a way of thinking. It is obviously connected to your brain. Isaiah 32 verse 8 says, "But a generous man," listen to it, "devises." Another translation says schemes. A generous man schemes or devises or plans generous things, and by generosity he shall stand. Notice the word devises. Not necessarily a word we use all the time apart from when we talk about our iPhone device. But devises is a slightly different word, and it means to be intentional, to put plans aside, to scheme, to be intentional and to plan. Sometimes generosity can be spontaneous, but it should also be devised. It needs to be planned. It needs to be intentional. It's a way of thinking. We are generous. We are generous disciples. We're generous people. We're a generous church, and we need to be intentional. We need to devise generosity. We need to devise generous things. We're not just generous on the outside, but we're generous in the way that we think. Generosity needs to be a way that we think. Generosity needs to be a mindset. It can't be something that is an obligation on the outside or external obligation where you feel guilty, so you do a generous act to appease to your guilt. That's not what generosity is. Generosity is devising, it's thinking, it's a spirit, it's a mindset. Proverbs 23 verse 7 says, "For as a man thinks in his heart, so he is." The context here is talking about a man who's laying before a group of people, his guests, a huge banquet, a banquet of food. It's got all the delights you can possibly imagine. But this man is quietly in himself thinking, I need to get these guys out. They're eating all my food. And so there's got this ironic situation where there's a man who's on the externally you could say he's generous. He's laying a very bountiful banquet. But really internally he's annoyed that people are actually eating the food that he laid out, that he paid for. In other words, you can't just be generous in terms of your actions. It's got to come from a mindset. It's got to come from the heart. It's got to come from the way that we think. We can't just bolt on generous deeds onto a stingy heart. We need to be generous in terms of the way that we think. It's a mindset. So here's the application. Be generous in your thoughts towards others. That has so many applications to it, but I want to encourage you as a disciple, as a part of CityLife Church, as a leader coming through CityLife Church. I want to encourage you to be generous in your thoughts towards others. In other words, be thoughtful. Be a thoughtful person. Plan to be thoughtful towards others. Why? Because it's the way that we think. As a man thinks in his heart, so he is. A generous man devises generous things. It's a way of thinking. We've got to be thoughtful towards others. I want to encourage you to be a thoughtful person. Do not just be consumed with our own thoughts, which, let's be honest, it's so easy to do, but let's be someone who is thoughtful towards others. And out of that, we devise generous things. So it's a way of thinking. But the atomy of the generous is more than just the way that we think. It's also, number two, a way of seeing. A way of seeing. It's the way that we see. Proverbs 22 verse 9, it says, "He who has a generous eye," obviously we're talking about a way of seeing, which is talking about the eye. "He who has a generous eye will be blessed, for he gives of his bread to the poor." You see, how we see is a reflection of our inner state of affairs. How we see the world is determined by our inner world. So we see not according to how things are externally, we see according to how we are. We see from the inside out. And so a generous person, what do? They notice needs. It says here in the verse again in Proverbs 22 verse 9, it says, for he gives of his bread to the poor. And so we recognize need. We see need in people's lives. A generous person notices the need in others. I don't just want us to think about, the verse says poor, but I really think it's talking about need. And obviously given to the poor is an important thing to do, to be thoughtful and mindful about the poor. But I want us to think about the principle that this is teaching us, which is noticing the need in others. Again, we could be so consumed with our own thoughts and our own situations that we forget to look outward. But what does a righteous person do, a generous person do? They notice need in others. I want to ask you a question. Are you noticing the need in others? all around us, maybe as you gather in a connect group, as we do things on a Sunday, as we live our lives in the workplace. What does generosity look like? It looks like noticing the need. I want us to be more aware, more sensitive of the need around us. We live in a world right now that has so much need. And all we need to do, we don't have all the resource within us to meet all those needs, but God has given us, maybe it's a word of encouragement, God's given us something where that we can impart to others, that we can notice needs, and we can meet needs from what God's given us. We want to be someone who pours into other people. That's a theme that we're coming back to time and time again. So are you noticing the need in others? Here's the application. Look for opportunities to bless and encourage and be generous. Look for them. It's a way of seeing. Generosity is a way of seeing. It's in the eye. It's a way of seeing. So I want to encourage you to look for opportunities this month to bless, impart, encourage, bring hope to, bring encouragement to, and to be generous. The third thing right here, and obviously there's a crossover with these things, the atomy of the generous. Number 3, a way of speaking. That's the third thing, a way of speaking. Proverbs 18 verse 21 says, and maybe you know this verse well, the tongue has the power of life and death, and those who love it will eat its fruit. There's power in the tongue. The tongue has power, the power of life and death. We know this, don't we? We know that our language can lift rooms, or the language can bury rooms. Our language imparts something to others. Here's the application. Use your words to bring life. Use your words to bring life. We live in a culture of cynicism and negativity, don't we? That's our culture. Just take one look on social media and you'll see the reflection of that right there. We live in a culture that is suspicious of people all the time, and we can bring that into our daily interactions. We can bring that into our own lives, but let's protect against cynicism and negativity and those toxic things. As a church, we want to have a healthy culture. As disciples, we want to have a healthy culture of the heart. And so we need to determine, what does generosity look like? Generosity has a sound to it. Generosity speaks. It's a language. We want to impart not negativity or hopelessness, but we want to impart life-given words. It could be face-to-face. It could be on WhatsApp. It could be text. It could be email. Whatever it may be, whatever way it's done, whatever vehicle we choose to do it, the point is, generous people are generous in how they speak about others, how they talk to others. Gossip can so easy go into the gutter, can't it? Everyone likes a good gossip sometimes. But if people are gossiping to you, they're probably also gossiping about you. Isn't that true? And so if someone goes up to you and gossips, chances are they've gone up to somebody else and gossiped about you. That's just the nature of gossip. But let's lift our language, and let's be people who are generous, who speaks life. I guess you get the point. So that brings me to number 4. So the atomy of the generous is a way of thinking in our mind, a way of seeing in our eye, a way of speaking, which is about our mouth, and number 4, a way of trusting, which is about the heart. A way of trusting. Proverbs 3 verse 5 and 6 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to God, and He will make your paths straight. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. May the Lord have all your allegiance, all your trust may be put upon the Lord. May it be a heart thing. May it not be an obligation, but may you trust from the heart. May you trust from the heart with all your heart. To be generous is a matter of the heart. It's a matter of trusting God. You can't fake genuine generosity. Generosity is ultimately a matter of trusting God. When we trust God, it changes the internal posture of the heart from being closed-handed or being closed-fisted to being open-handed. That's the posture of our heart. It's to be open-handed to others, to not be stingy, because the world of the stingy gets smaller and smaller, but the world of the generous gets larger and larger. Let's be big-spirited people. Let's not be stingy. Let's not be cynical. Let's not be skeptical, but let's be open-handed. Let's understand that what was the Abrahamic word over Abraham was, Abraham, you're blessed to be a blessing. You're blessed to be a blessing. In other words, live open-handed. Don't live tight-fisted, but live open-handed. And here's the thing. Open-handedness or generosity is a result of our internal posture. And our internal posture is reflected by our trust or lack of trust in God. Generosity is the recognition that I will survive even in the face of unmet needs, and that my Heavenly Father can look after me even as He does with the sparrows. Generosity recognizes that gathering more things can never fill the void that only God can fill. Generosity recognizes that doing goodness to others less fortunate is the way of the kingdom. The spirit of generosity is not about what you have, it's always about searching for ways to bless others. And so it's a matter of the heart. Generosity is a way of trusting. It's a way of believing. It's a matter of the heart. And so a question for us to land on today in this month's session is, what is blocking you from being a blessing? What is blocking you? What in your heart, what heart issue is blocking you from being a blessing? In what area of your life are you being tight-fisted rather than open-handed? Here's the application. What heart issue is limiting your generosity? This is about taking a moment to reflect. God, what is blocking me from being a blessing? Why is it that I'm so consumed? Why is it I've been so consumed with myself? God wants to change the internal posture. Those areas of our life that we struggle with trusting God, those can be the blocks that stop us from being generous. I think this pandemic has caused us to become so inward. We've closed the door on the world. And it's caused us, if we're not careful, we can become very self-consumed. We can become very inward-looking. But let's not allow that to happen with us. Let's open our life up. Let's be the way of the generous. A generous person, it's a way of thinking, it's a way of speaking, it's a way of seeing, and it's a way of trusting. And for those who are watching this, the majority of people watching this who are part of CityLife Church, I want to encourage you that the baseline of generosity is trusting God in your finances. That we need to be trusting God. We need to make sure that our definition of generosity is not our own definition, but God's definition. And there's the tithe, there's the trust in God in your finances, which is the giving of the tithe. And the tithe is not about God wanting something from us, but rather the tithe is about God wanting something for us. There's a big difference. When we trust God with our income, setting aside 10%, this is a decision to trust God from the heart. It helps us to understand that God is our provider and God is our source. But that is only the baseline of generosity. There's a generous life, a generous culture, a generous mentality, a generous sight, a generous speaking, a generous heart that God wants to build into us as His children, as His disciples. And so, as a church, we are generous. Let's cultivate that as individuals in our own lives. And let's be trusting God to be open-handed. Not be tight-fisted, but open-handed. Let's have a generous opinion of others. Let's be building people up. Let's bring a blessing. We're blessed to be a blessing. And there's hundreds of applications there, but I want you to do a reflection. Part of this whole thing is not just listening to content or watching content, but there's a reflection form. And so right now there's a reflection form being sent to you on email. If you're not on our Culture Lab email list, you can go to our website /culture, and there's a link on that page where you can click that reflection form, and you can process this reflection form. Is about processing the content to build this into our life, to make sure that we're applying what we're learning. And so thanks for being part of Culture Lab June. Join us next month in July on the first Monday of the month as we drop another episode of Culture Lab, unpacking yet another value that we have as a church. Have a great week. Remember, leadership culture groups, coaching groups are happening, and so why not plug into those coaching groups as well? They're happening on the 14th of June. And so if you still have time, sign up to that, and we'd love to process this together and grow together as disciples and as leaders.